So let's talk about the 8-mark question which you'll be facing if you sit the literature components for the OCR GCSE exam, either prose or verse. So these questions are asking you to analyse the style of an author. So they are very challenging. You're analysing the style of an author in not only a foreign language but a dead language. It's one of the things that is most challenging about the literature component. So you do need to practice, that's really important, and I will come back to that at the end of the video and show you how to do that. Practice is absolutely essential. You're not going to be able to do this without practicing it. So here's an example of the kind of question that you might be asked. How does Caesar convey the importance and the authority of the Druids in these lines? You should refer to the Latin and discuss Caesar's use of language. So the examiner is immediately flagging up to you that you need to quote in Latin and you need to talk about the way in which Caesar writes. So key things to consider, firstly, the time pressure that you're under. Now, 8 marks in theory is 8 minutes given the time ratio of the exam. However, this question is so challenging, I would spend longer than 8 minutes on it. There are other questions in the exam, a huge number of questions in the exam that are very quick and easy to answer. That will take less than 1 minute per mark. So you really ought to be able to claw 10 minutes for yourself. Absolute maximum of 12, however. You've got to bear in mind it's 8 marks, but it's only 8 marks, so don't go too mad. So give yourself a cap and practice spending ideally 10 to 11 minutes. You need to make sure that you cover the whole passage, so whatever lines that they give you, make sure that you are quoting something from towards the beginning, something in the middle and something from the end. Don't just focus on one section of the passage because that will affect your mark. Very important that you need to make style points, not just content points. So if you only talk about the meaning of words and nothing else, your answer will be capped at around half marks. You've got to give the examiner a range of stylistic points in your answer. Obviously, this goes for, without saying really, for all questions that are longer answer questions. You've got to answer the question and be swift and smart about how you do that. So don't keep repeating yourself. Just make sure that the points that you're making link directly to what you've been asked to talk about. Now, also hugely important, your examiner is looking for volume in your answer. So as I've talked about in my other video about the 10-mark question, your examiner is not allowed to give you a mark that is lower than the number of ticks he gives you. So you want to be forcing your examiner to give you at least 8 ticks. So if you are quoting from the text at least 8 times and saying something sensible and creditable about that quotation, he's going to have little choice than to give you full marks. So that's what you want to aim for. This is an acronym that I teach my students to use when answering style questions. Mrs. VP, meaning, repetition, sound, vivid present, and position. So these are all things that you can talk about under pressure in the exam. So meaning, words with a powerful meaning, so using a word that means something like slaughter rather than just kill. Compound verbs are a verb that you might recognize, for example, currit, run, but it has a preposition glued onto the front of it and becomes concurrent and therefore has a more powerful meaning. You can talk about that. Words whose meaning is metaphorical, so incensus or ardens both mean something like burning or on fire. Repetition is pretty easy to spot. You can talk about the repetition of words, phrases or sounds. And of those sounds, you would be picking out potentially alliteration, assonance, sibilance, cacophony and onomatopoeia. You don't need all these technical terms literally, but it can help because it can actually make things quicker to talk about. But even if you only pick out alliteration and onomatopoeia because they're familiar to you, that's fine. Vivid present is when the author uses verbs in the present tense to create excitement. It makes it feel like the action is happening right in front of you. Virgil does this a huge amount. And finally, position, hugely important in Latin and a guaranteed style point. So in verse, you could always pick out the first word in every line, see if there's anything interesting going on there. So I teach my students to literally run their finger down the first word in every line in a verse passage and think, okay, which one of these have something worth mentioning? There is also the phenomenon of hyperbaton. That's two words that go together grammatically. So, for example, a noun and an adjective, or a noun and a participle, and they're separated out in the line. Immediately you've got something to say. And there's obviously juxtaposition as well, when words are placed next to each other to create an effect. So back to our example, how does Caesar convey the importance and the authority of the Druids in these lines? So I'm going to show you an example answer from one of my students. So Amy produced this as one of her first ever attempts at an 8-mark answer, and I've chosen this because it's not perfect. I'm sure that now she's practiced this many times, she could produce something better. But this is my point. She listened to what I had to say, she applied it, and she produced an answer that certainly I think would be in the top band because she really has gone about it in the right way. So what does she do? So she picks out a phrase that's repeated, publica ac privata. Now notice what she's done. She's quoted the Latin, that's the priority, then in brackets after it she's told me what it means in English. That's really important. Your examiner needs to know that you understand what the Latin means. Really crucial. So never quote without giving the meaning as well. You need both. So she's talked about its meaning. She's talked about the fact that it's repeated. Then she also mentions that there's this plosive alliteration. So if she'd only said he uses plosive alliteration here, your examiner might be within his rights to say, well, so what? But because she's talked about the repetition and the meaning as well, she's immediately got a decent quality point. Then she talks about the compound verb I mentioned earlier, concurrit. So rather than just currit, he uses concurrit. This shows how respected they are, that people are desperate for their teaching, so they rush towards the Druids. Then she talks about the repetition of si, meaning if. Notice how careful she's being throughout to tell me what the words mean, as well as quote them in Latin. And then she expands upon this point. So rather than just saying, oh, he repeats if, well, again, so what? She picks out one of the phrases that's within that series of repetition, talks about the meaning of the word kaides, and talks about that in relation to the question. So that immediately makes it another decent point. So then here she goes on to pick out a superlative, gravissima, quotes it, tells me what it means, defines it as a superlative. Very simple point, but a very valid one. Then she picks out this phrase, impiorum ac scelestorem, tells me what it means, wicked and criminal, talks about the fact that it's a tautology, so she didn't have to use that technical term. If you didn't know it, that would be okay. You'd have to explain. So it's using two words that have a closely related or similar meaning for emphasis. So she's getting tired at this point. So she's picked out another superlative. Great. Forgot to tell me what it means, and then notice she squeezed that in afterwards, which is fantastic. So she obviously either realised straight away or went back over her answer. And then she finally finishes with this last point that she just managed to squeeze in about etiam even being used for emphasis. So as I say, this is not an exemplary answer, but it's a really good, solid answer. For her first attempt, it was remarkably good. And you know what? The examiner would have a tough case pushing this down the mark scheme. He would have to consider giving her a top band mark. So When you practice your answers, this is what I suggest you judge your answers against. Now, this is not the official mark scheme. The official mark scheme is frankly pretty unhelpful. Uses phrases like answer fully shaped for purpose, which helps nobody, including the examiner. But this is what the examiners are looking for. Really important that you've got a clear and correct understanding of the text. So you quote in Latin, you tell your examiner what it means. If you get that wrong, you are going to come hurtling down the mark scheme because your examiner will immediately think you don't understand what's in front of you, and it could make your point invalid. So really important that you know your text really well. Refer to my other video about how to learn your set text. That's a given. Absolutely crucial that you know the text. Remember about volume of points. You always want to aim for 8 separate points, forcing your examiner to give you 8 ticks. They're looking for volume. If you just make 4 points, no matter how good they are, you are playing a dangerous game. Make your quotations short, not least because you're under time pressure, but also your examiner is looking for close analysis about just a couple of words. So quote in the Latin, 2 or 3 words, then in brackets tell your examiner what it means, then make your point. You need to make a variety of style points. So a weaker candidate would pick out a word, hopefully tell you the examiner what it means, and say it's in alliteration. Well, okay, so what? So you need a variety of style points. Use my Mrs. VP acronym. And if you're going to pick out something like alliteration, try and make that tacked on to a much bigger and better point about the meaning, the position, the vivid present, whatever. So don't just cling to alliteration, because that tends to be what weaker candidates do. Don't waffle, don't write at length, you don't have time. So you want short quotations and a series of bullet points. Don't actually put the blobs of bullet points, but imagine that you are writing a series of bullet points and you can't really go wrong. Look out for words or short quotations that you can say more than one thing about. Don't spend too long, because remember you want volume, but if you're going to pick out a word that's at the start of a line and you don't tell your examiner that it's in the vivid present, for example, again, he's going to be suspicious that you don't really understand what's in front of you. So just give yourself those extra couple of seconds. Have I said everything that I can about this word? Now, terminology, you actually don't need technical terminology at GCSE level, but I would recommend learning a few keywords just because they make your life easier. You don't have to explain to your examiner the technique being used. You can use the technical term, but do make sure you're getting them right and you know how to spell them. Otherwise, you are going to irritate your examiner. And then finally, again, bit of a given, your examiner needs to be able to read what you've written, needs to be legible, and he needs to be able to comprehend what you're saying. So you need to write in full, correct sentences. So I talked about how important practice is. So here's how you do it. You don't need your teacher to set you an 8-mark question. You can set yourself one. Take any section of your set text, take a small chunk. Ask yourself a generic 8-mark question. So something like, how does the author make this passage interesting or dramatic or exciting or whatever? Doesn't really matter. You can practice that. Then practice in time conditions. 10, 11, absolute maximum of 12 minutes. Never, ever, ever practice doing this for longer. There's no point. You have to practice doing it under pressure. If you don't have 10 or 11 minutes, just do a quick brainstorm for 2 minutes. What would I pick out? If you're going to write a full answer, then judge it against the criteria that I've just taken you through. Have you managed those 8 steps to get yourself those 8 marks? And keep practicing. Really important. Good luck and get in touch if I can help.